Classical physics became powerful because it learned how to describe things that could be measured from the outside. It excels at trajectories, forces, fields, motion, energy, and interactions. If an object moves, classical physics can often tell you how and why it moved. If two objects interact, it can describe the exchange taking place between them. The entire framework is built around relationships that can be observed without becoming the thing being observed. You may notice something important when you begin looking closely at that assumption. Every measurement already depends upon an observer who receives the measurement. Every equation is ultimately interpreted by awareness. Every model exists inside experience before it exists inside science. Classical physics can describe the object being measured, but it quietly assumes the existence of the one doing the measuring. Most people never notice this because the system works extraordinarily well within its intended domain. Bridges stand, aircraft fly, satellites orbit, technologies function. The success of the framework creates the impression that it is also complete. Yet usefulness and completeness are not the same thing. A map can successfully guide someone through a city while containing no description of the person reading the map. The map may be accurate regarding roads, distances, and intersections. It may even be the best map ever created. Yet the awareness interpreting the symbols remains absent from the document itself. Something similar begins to appear when consciousness enters the discussion. The challenge is not that consciousness contradicts physics. The challenge is that consciousness occupies a different position within reality than the objects physics was designed to describe. A rock can be observed, a star can be observed, a particle can be observed. Consciousness is the condition through which observation becomes possible in the first place. That difference sounds subtle until its implications begin unfolding. Classical models explain how information moves from one place to another. They explain how signals travel through systems. They explain how structures organize and interact. What they do not explain is why any of that activity should be accompanied by experience. You can describe every component of a musical instrument without describing music itself. You can measure the wood, the strings, the tension, and the vibration frequencies. You can account for every physical process occurring inside the instrument. Yet none of those measurements explain the experience of hearing a melody. The mechanism can be described in extraordinary detail while the experience remains untouched. This is why many discussions about consciousness become confused. People often assume that increasing detail automatically produces explanation. If enough neurons are mapped, enough signals tracked, and enough processes understood, consciousness is expected to appear as a conclusion. Yet explanation and correlation are not identical. Knowing what accompanies an experience is not the same as knowing why experience exists at all. You can see this pattern in everyday life. A brain scan may reveal activity associated with joy, sadness, love, or fear. Researchers may accurately identify the neural patterns involved. The correlation may be real and valuable. Yet the scan does not contain the feeling itself. The image reveals activity. The experience remains first person. This does not diminish neuroscience. It simply reveals the boundary between description and experience. A description can tell you what is happening. Experience tells you what it is like. Classical physics was constructed to excel at the first category. Consciousness continually points toward the second. The deeper implication is that consciousness may not be another object inside reality. It may represent a fundamentally different aspect of reality altogether. If that possibility is ignored, every attempt to explain consciousness becomes an attempt to force it into a category it never belonged to. The result is often endless refinement of mechanisms without resolution of the underlying question. You may notice this occurring whenever people say that consciousness is merely an illusion. An illusion is still experienced. A hallucination is still experienced. A dream is still experienced. Even the statement that consciousness is not real requires consciousness in order to be made. The very thing being dismissed remains present throughout the dismissal. That creates a curious situation. The observer cannot be removed from the equation because every equation is ultimately known by an observer. The experiencer cannot be eliminated from reality because elimination itself becomes an experience. Consciousness continually occupies a position that is both obvious and strangely difficult to describe. It is closer than every object, yet harder to define than any object. This is where perspective begins changing. The question may not be how consciousness emerges from physical processes. The question may become whether physical processes are being viewed from too narrow a perspective. What if consciousness is not a product appearing at the end of complexity? What if consciousness is one of the conditions that make complexity knowable at all? Notice how different those two approaches feel. In one model, consciousness is a late arrival inside a physical universe. In the other, consciousness participates in the very possibility of a known universe. One treats awareness as a result. The other treats awareness as a foundational factor that must be accounted for from the beginning. Neither position should be accepted blindly. The purpose is not to replace one belief with another. The purpose is to recognize where the limits of a framework become visible. Classical physics remains extraordinarily powerful within its domain. The question is whether consciousness is asking us to expand the domain rather than abandon it. Because once that possibility is considered, the conversation begins shifting away from whether physics is wrong and toward a far more interesting question. What kind of reality would be required if matter and consciousness were not competitors, but expressions of a larger structure that neither classical physics nor traditional spirituality has fully described yet? The moment consciousness is treated as foundational rather than accidental, an entirely different landscape begins to appear. Questions that once seemed impossible start rearranging themselves into questions that can actually be explored. The mystery does not disappear, but its shape changes. Instead of asking how awareness emerges from a universe that is supposedly unconscious, we begin asking what a universe would look like if awareness were already woven into its structure. That shift may seem small at first, yet it changes the direction of the entire investigation. Notice how often modern discussions assume that reality begins with objects. Matter is treated as primary. Structures are treated as primary. Interactions are treated as primary. Awareness is then expected to arrive later as a byproduct of sufficient complexity. But this assumption is rarely proven. It is usually inherited. A fish born in water may never think to question water, not because water is obvious, but because it is everywhere. In much the same way, a culture built around material explanation naturally begins with matter as its starting point. The starting point feels self-evident precisely because it has been assumed for so long. Yet history repeatedly shows that assumptions often become visible only when a new perspective arrives. You can see this pattern throughout science itself. There was a time when Earth appeared to be the center of everything. There was a time when space was thought to be fixed and absolute. There was a time when atoms were believed to be indivisible. Each framework explained many observations successfully, yet eventually a deeper layer became visible and the old framework had to expand. Expansion is different from rejection. The discovery that Earth is not the center of the solar system did not make astronomy worthless. The discovery of relativity did not make Newton irrelevant. The discovery of quantum mechanics did not eliminate classical mechanics. The older systems remained useful while being recognized as incomplete descriptions of a larger reality. This possibility deserves careful attention when discussing consciousness. If awareness turns out to be more fundamental than previously assumed, classical physics does not suddenly become false. It remains extraordinarily accurate within its domain. What changes is our understanding of the domain itself. The map remains valuable while the territory becomes larger. You may notice that human experience already hints at this distinction. Most people spend their lives focused on the contents of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. Thoughts appear, emotions appear, sensations appear, images appear, memories appear. Yet the awareness in which they appear often goes largely unnoticed. This creates a strange habit of perception. We become experts at studying what enters awareness while rarely examining awareness directly. We analyze experiences. We categorize experiences. We compare experiences. Yet the field in which all experience occurs remains mostly invisible because it is always present. Consider what happens when you sit quietly and watch your own thoughts. A thought appears, then another, then another. Some are useful, some are repetitive, some seem important. Yet the fact that you can observe them reveals something remarkable. The observer and the thought are not identical. This does not mean they are separate in the ordinary sense. It means they occupy different roles within experience. Thoughts are observed, awareness observes. The distinction may feel subtle, but it is immediately verifiable through direct experience. No philosophy is required to notice it. The significance of this becomes clearer when we return to physics. Objects are measurable because they can be observed. Events are measurable because they can be observed. Processes are measurable because they can be observed. Consciousness, however, occupies the observing position itself. It is not simply another item within the inventory of things being measured. This is why attempts to reduce consciousness entirely to physical activity often feel incomplete, even when they produce useful findings. Findings may be accurate. The neural correlations may be real. The biological mechanisms may be essential. Yet something remains unresolved because the observer keeps getting translated into observations. The position of awareness becomes confused with the contents appearing within awareness. Imagine studying every frame of a movie while never noticing the screen. Every scene could be analyzed. Every character could be described. Every moment could be measured. Yet the screen will remain hidden precisely because it is present in every frame. Its constant presence makes it easy to overlook. Many contemplative traditions noticed this long before modern science began wrestling with consciousness. They repeatedly pointed attention toward awareness itself rather than merely its contents. The language varied across cultures and centuries, but the observation remained surprisingly consistent. What we normally call experience appears within something more fundamental than the experiences themselves. This does not automatically solve the scientific problem. Direct experience alone does not provide a complete model of reality. At the same time, measurement alone does not provide a complete account of experience. Both perspectives reveal something important. The challenge may not be choosing between them, but understanding how they fit together. That possibility opens a much larger conversation. Perhaps consciousness and matter are not competing explanations. Perhaps they are two perspectives on a deeper process neither side fully captures in isolation. One describes structure, the other describes experience. One examines what appears, the other reveals that appearance is occurring. If this is true, many debates begin looking different. The question stops being whether consciousness is real or matter is real. Few people seriously doubt either one. The deeper question becomes how these two aspects of reality relate to each other. What mechanism allows structure and experience to coexist so intimately that they appear inseparable during ordinary life? You may notice that this question naturally leads beyond the limits of classical thinking. Not because classical physics failed, but because it succeeded so well within a specific frame that the frame itself became difficult to see. Consciousness invites us to examine the frame. It asks us to investigate not only what reality contains, but what makes reality knowable in the first place. And once that question becomes visible, another possibility quietly emerges. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why consciousness exists within the universe. Perhaps the greater mystery is whether the universe we experience can ever be fully understood without first understanding the nature of the awareness through which every universe is known. The deeper this investigation goes, the more we begin to recognize that the difficulty may never have been consciousness itself. The difficulty may have been our habit of treating consciousness as an object rather than the condition that allows objects to appear. We search for it the way we search for planets, particles, and processes. We look for a thing among things. Yet awareness consistently occupies a different position within experience. It is present before any particular experience arrives and remains present as experiences change. This is why the question continues to resist simple answers. A microscope can reveal smaller structures. A telescope can reveal distant structures. Mathematical models can reveal hidden structures. Yet every instrument ultimately delivers its results to awareness. No matter how advanced the measurement becomes, the final observation still occurs within consciousness itself. The observer remains built into every act of observation. You may notice something interesting when you reflect on this. Most scientific mysteries become smaller as knowledge accumulates. Questions narrow, variables become clearer, uncertainty decreases. Consciousness behaves differently because the investigation continually circles back toward the investigator. The closer we approach the center of the problem, the more we encounter the one who is asking the question. That does not make consciousness supernatural. It simply makes it unique. Gravity does not study gravity. Electromagnetism does not wonder about electromagnetism. Conscious beings investigate the nature of consciousness because consciousness contains the ability to reflect upon itself. This recursive quality may be one of the most significant features of reality. The implications become larger than many people initially realize. If awareness is somehow woven into the structure of existence, then consciousness is not a late-stage accident appearing at the edge of cosmic history. Instead, conscious experience becomes part of the story from the beginning, not necessarily in the form we experience now, but as a fundamental aspect of reality's unfolding. Many people immediately resist this possibility because they assume it diminishes science. Yet the opposite may be true. Expanding a framework does not weaken it. Expansion allows investigation to continue where previous assumptions reach their limits. Science is always advanced by questioning what appeared unquestionable. Consciousness may simply represent the next frontier of that same process. You can already see signs of this shift emerging across multiple fields. Questions that were once dismissed are now being examined more carefully. Researchers continue exploring perception, cognition, subjective experience, integrated information, quantum foundations, and the nature of observation itself. No universal answer has appeared, but the willingness to ask deeper questions continues growing. This willingness matters because every major advance begins with the question becoming permissible. Before a solution arrives, curiosity must arrive. Before a breakthrough appears, assumptions must loosen. Progress often begins not with certainty, but with the recognition that certainty arrived too early. The most important realization may be that the conversation is still unfolding. There is also a practical dimension to this discussion that is often overlooked. Most people encounter consciousness only as an abstract debate. They hear theories, they hear arguments, they hear competing interpretations, yet every person already possesses direct access to the phenomenon being discussed. Consciousness is not distant. It is the most immediate aspect of experience. This creates a rare situation where observation can occur from two directions simultaneously. Science can continue examining external structures. Individuals can continue examining direct experience. Neither approach invalidates the other. In many ways, they may be approaching the same mystery from opposite sides. You may notice that genuine insight often emerges when these perspectives begin meeting rather than competing. External investigation reveals how reality behaves. Internal observation reveals how reality appears. One studies structure, one studies experience. Together, they create a more complete picture than either could produce alone. The future of this conversation may depend less on choosing sides and more on learning how to integrate perspectives. History shows that reality rarely conforms to simple either-or divisions. Wave or particle became wave and particle. Space or time became space-time. Separate forces became unified descriptions under deeper frameworks. Nature often reveals connections where human thinking initially sees oppositions. Consciousness may eventually reveal a similar pattern. The choice between matter and awareness may turn out to be less fundamental than we imagine. What appears as two separate categories may emerge from a deeper level of organization not yet fully understood. The history of science repeatedly points toward increasing unity beneath apparent division. If that possibility proves correct, then the mystery of consciousness transforms once again. The question is no longer merely how awareness arises. The question becomes what kind of reality can produce both physical structure and lived experience as complementary expressions of the same underlying process. That is a far larger inquiry than many people realize when they first encounter the problem. Notice how this changes the emotional tone of the discussion as well. Consciousness stops being an anomaly that must somehow be explained away. Instead, it becomes an invitation to expand our understanding of reality itself. The mystery remains, but it becomes a productive mystery rather than a frustrating one. It becomes a doorway rather than a wall. This is often how genuine discovery feels before it arrives. The old framework still functions. The new framework is not yet complete. Questions multiply faster than answers. Yet beneath the uncertainty, there is a growing sense that something important is becoming visible. The edges of understanding begin stretching toward territory that previously seemed unreachable. Perhaps that is where we stand today. Not at the end of the investigation, but at a threshold where some of our deepest assumptions are becoming visible for the first time. Classical physics revealed extraordinary truths about the measurable world. Modern physics expanded that vision further. The study of consciousness may now be inviting another expansion, one that asks not only what reality is made of, but what it means for reality to be knowable at all. And as that question continues unfolding, it quietly leads toward an even deeper one. If awareness is not merely something that exists within the universe, but somehow participates in the very possibility of experience itself, then understanding consciousness may eventually reveal that the greatest discovery was never about what we observe, but about the relationship between the observer, the observed, and the deeper reality from which both continue to emerge.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.